So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, broadcast and recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new media and baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Craig Glazer, the author of a new book called The King of Sting, might remind you of another good guy, bad guy, Frank Abagnale Jr., the author of Catch Me If You Can. You remember the movie, Leonardo DiCaprio? The difference, I think, is that Abagnale was a scam artist. Glazer was a sting artist. Subtle difference? We'll see. Craig, welcome to Mr. Media.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys.
Hey, glad to have you here. So let's talk about that. As I've been reading the book, I was thinking a lot about Abagnale, and
right.
But his thing was different. Can you let's talk about the difference, and then we'll get into a little bit about what it is that you had done.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Frank. I met him when I was out trying to set The King of Sting up as a movie. It was a thing called Outlaws. I only had lived half the story. When you're living this, you always think it's over. And just kind of like in Godfather 3, they pull you back in and you end up doing more stuff. But Frank and I had the same literary agent, Harold Moskowitz, back in the early 80s, and we went around and did interviews like this, more newspaper interviews, and his book had been out a bit, but, until the movie came out much later, he was relatively unknown. And our story, mine and Don Woodbeck, my partner, who was alive then, was a lot more, as you know from reading it, I guess there was a lot more violence because the big difference is Don and I posed as law enforcement officers down in Phoenix and did stings, which to define stings are pretending to be someone you're not, like Frank was, and we pretend to be in law enforcement. And then we would basically rob drug dealers and arrest them posing as cops. And I was a college student, and Woodbeck was a Vietnam vet. We had a crew of about 11 guys eventually, and we did these things all over the country for a couple of years. Frank, as you know from the movie and the book, pretty much put on different outfits and pretended to briefly be a pilot or a lawyer or a doctor and would basically cash checks. So he didn't have a partner, and I don't know how long Frank's thing went on, but it was quite different. I mean, ours was more modern-day Butch and Sundance, and his was more of a one-man thing, and there was really no violence in his. We were did over 30 stings and resulted in 4 shootouts, and then later I became a real undercover special agent for the Attorney General's office when I was 20. So we get a lot of comparisons, but it's quite different.
Well, I was thinking of Frank. I actually had a brief connection to Frank myself. Before the movie Catch Me If You Can came out, I had talked to Frank at some length about working with him on a follow-up book. It was many years after Catch Me If You Can, but before the movie, as you mentioned, and spent a little time with him. And I know that he, when his scam career ended, also kind of turned to the other side and got involved in law enforcement and working with, I think, Treasury Department. And
right.
So, yeah, I mean, there's some similarity there.
Unfortunately, I got back into doing stings, and Frank didn't, which sent me to prison, and not Frank. Yeah. But anyway, it's a little different.
It's a little different in that way.
A little different.
But there's something that people can connect to. You got involved. You're in college. There was a drug deal that went bad. Right. You had a real connection to the movies and got involved in this. Did you ever think that this would become a career of sorts, or
Well, when I was in high school in Kansas City, where I was born and raised, before I moved down to Phoenix to go to Arizona State in the early 70s, I had been reading in school, in the library, actually, when my other friends would go to Taco Bell or McDonald's. I would stick around and read about Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, John Dillinger, Carl Capolino, F. Lee Bailey, on and on and on. I was mesmerized by gunfighters and outlaws, and back in being a baby boomer and the media being somewhat different, I was in love with all these people on television and the movies, and really thought everyone wanted to be one of those guys. I didn't realize that people really didn't think that way, but I did, and I took that concept with me in my head that's why I picked Arizona State, because it was kind of the last vestige of the American West. So when I went down there, I guess there was a part of me that was kind of looking for an excuse to become what I became. And after I did my first sting, posing as a cop with Woodbeck, because I never would have done it alone, who I met down there, who eventually became my partner, I began to see it as a career pretty quickly after we did a couple of them. I first wanted to get revenge for being robbed, and then, I was making a lot of money, staying in school. It made me locally kind of infamous and famous at the same time, and I was 18 years old, so, in a way, it was kind of like being a rock star, or a movie star, or an athlete in a small way. And these are the things that really drive us: is the adrenaline rush, the ego, and what you think's coming at you. And I knew living it then that one day I'd hoped it would be a legendary story, but I knew I had to live a lot more of it and survive for that to happen.
There were a couple guys early in the story, part of the supporting cast, if you will. You mentioned Woodbeck, and the other guy who stood out in my mind. Well, I guess the Attorney General later in the story in Kansas. But your dad, Stan. So I want to ask you, tell me a little bit. Paint the picture first of all of Don Woodbeck. You met him, and he really, the combination of the two of you really sets off this story. Is he a little more colorful in the book than he was in person, or did you tamp him down a little bit?
I think we probably calmed him down a shade. I mean, of course, the listeners may be wondering, basically what happened to me, just to give a thumbnail so you can understand how I came into it. I was a student. I was broke. You mentioned my dad, Stan. And like a lot of stories in real life, I think a lot of us can relate to this story, The King of Sting, because, I had a love-hate with my dad. I think all young men generally want to please their parents, yet we can't wait to get away from them and go away to college to prove ourselves. My dad, pretty much browbeat me and expected more out of me than I could deliver because he was an unhappy guy, and that's not unusual. It was a dysfunctional family. Sadly, in America, most families are. It's not unusual, and it's just a matter of how you handle it. So I got down there, had no money, and what I did was wrong, but, that my excuse was what it was. I took my last $300 and put it into a weed deal. We got ripped off. There's about 10 or 12 college kids, and we had several $1,000s. They weren't after just my $300. And some low-level Mexican mob guys, we called them prairie pirates, kicked the door in and pulled out guns instead of weed and beat the bejesus out of us. And, I wanted to go after these guys, and after they left, and one of the kids that tried to help me got his nose about taken off by a Bowie knife that one of them had. Everybody said, Craig, we can't go after them. They have guns. They'll kill us. And I went, well, call the cops. We've been robbed. And they go, what are we going to tell them? We were doing a dope deal, you idiot.
Yeah.
So I went back to the frat. I was a SIG-Ep, and I was a freshman, and, went around complaining about what happened. No one was going to do anything. I saw a movie called The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and in that story, the story, the Capone guys dress as cops and gunned down the Bugs Moran men on that famous shootout on St. Valentine's Day in Chicago. So that gave me the idea. And the cop thing had been done, but not like we did it. I now employed all the ideas I had from movies and books. And one thing I realized was you got to do it right. And, I kind of laid it out like a football coach. I went down, and, well, first I needed a partner. And you mentioned Woodbeck. I was pointed toward him by others. No, he just had a reputation of being a badass. And I was 18. Don would have been in his mid-20s, back from Vietnam. Met him in a bar. He was pointed out to me. He was shooting pool, and he looked like Charlie Bronson off the screen. Thinning blonde hair, blue eyes, wife beater, dropping every shot, telling Vietnam war stories. The handful of college students were just staring at him like he was Elvis. And I approached wearing a silk Nick shirt, David Cassidy haircut. He probably thought I was gay. And presented this concept of doing these robberies, posing as law enforcement. And he just thought I was some little schmucky kid. I was 5'10", probably weighed $160, if that. And he was kind of a big guy. And really, he became the Artful Dodger to my Oliver Twist. He saw an opportunity to use as he got to know me, my thinking ability, more of a Butch Cassidy, to his gunfighting, because he'd been a decorated soldier in Nam and wasn't afraid of anything. So, yeah, he became a big brother, a father figure. He trained me how to fight and shoot, and he brought in a couple of guys that he'd been in Vietnam with, Jim Hoyt, who would later be killed with Don later. in to work with us, and they trained me on, it was really cool to me because now I'm with the older big guys, and, they accept me as one of them, and I kind of planned as the stings went on how we would do them. Don knew where things were because he'd worked for the smugglers after Vietnam, so he was of great value, more than I thought he would be, and they had tried to kill him when he wouldn't smuggle heroin for the Mexican mob. So he had vengeance in his heart too. So it worked out well. I never planned on making a career out of it, and I wanted to stay. I remember when we were doing our first sting, which was actually out of Boston, Massachusetts, Cambridge, via Chicago. Some mobsters in Chicago had been ripped off, and a drug deal gone wrong for them. And Don had been driving marijuana then. It was all weed back then. Back then Coke wasn't popular. This was the early 70s. And we went up there, and that became our first sting. And I remember I was all worried about missing humanities classes and getting a bad grade. And Don was going, I'm worried about not getting killed, not about missing school. And so Woodbeck had a different view of life than I. We were complete opposites. I was upper middle class guy, more like most of you guys listening, and he was, just a tough street guy that was kind of a cross between a cowboy and a gunman.
Would you spend time with him? I mean, off time? I was kind of thinking about that while I was reading it. I mean, obviously, in a book, you condense a lot of time and a lot of experiences. But, in between stings, would you and Don just hang out? Or would you, go about your business with other people? Oh,
I was, for listeners, and in the book you can feel it in The King of Sting, he, was everything about me. How do I explain? When you're in high school, there's always the tough guys were always attracted to him, maybe the good athletes, because we really can't do what they do, and we want to be those guys. So I was enamored with him. I mean, he wasn't as educated as me, and it was smooth, and that's what he saw in me that he liked. So we'd go hang out, pick up girls, go to bars. I wouldn't say we were massively famous in Phoenix yet, but as time went on and the stories got out and the local legend grew, we did everything together. We went to Jamaica together. We went on trips to around the South besides the stings. But when we'd go out of town to Ohio or Vegas, wherever we were doing a sting, we'd stay in the same hotel room. So we became good friends. Eventually, as money came our way, we were buying condos, trying to invest our money, and so we'd have a future, so we wouldn't end up getting killed or going to prison doing what we were doing. And we eventually leased a very big semi-mansion in Clearwater Hills in Phoenix, in Scottsdale, the Badler Estate, and we lived there together. But just like any roommates, eventually the shine wore off, and I began to see things in him I wasn't crazy about, that he was different than me, and he wasn't me. I wanted to be famous and a legend, and he just wanted to, rip off thugs and make a bunch of money. So, everyone didn't think the way I did. I'd always talk about, man, this is going to be great in the movie, this is going to be great in the book, and he'd look at me like, what are you talking about? He go, everyone didn't think that way. I thought every move we made, every time I put on a shirt or a leather jacket or my upside-down shoulder holster, that it was somehow being videotaped somewhere, and this was going to be part of everything I did. My mind or my brain was a camera, and I thought everything could be a movie. He didn't think that way. It was just, get the money, buy some neat cowboy boots, and grab a girl, throw her down, and do whatever. Completely.
It's interesting. It's interesting that it started off, but you were enamored with him because he's the tough guy, and it eventually the roles, I think, turned around. I don't know that if Don were here today, if he would ever say that, well, I was enamored with Craig, but it was clear that he relied more and more on you. Actually, almost from the beginning, he would tell people, this guy's got an idea, and it would kind of grow out of that. So your roles kind of changed over time.
Yeah, if you saw, the movie that I, as a kid, fell in love with was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and I felt our relationship was very similar to theirs, at least the movie version of those two guys, and of course the movie's just that, and we know that a lot of it, there's poetic license, who knows what those guys were like, but at least I'm still around to paint this picture, and I think that's what's neat about the book. Sal Manna, who co-wrote it with me, is a graduate of Northwestern, a journalist that covered Woodbeck and I when Don was still alive, met him, interviewed him, and was at some of our hearings, and saw all the stuff go down for about a little over a decade, and knew it was all real, and that's why he was excited to co-write the book with me. So, unlike Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and the OK Corral, these are all legendary stories now, but we don't really know what really happened, why they shot those guys, who shot who, what really happened, because, you didn't have the media then like you do now. And
right.
I'm not saying this is the most true crime story ever, but it's probably as close as you can get. When I'm retelling stories of what was said in a room during an event, I have, it's the best I can do. And of course, in a book or a movie, you try and make it as exciting as you can and edit. But, I couldn't tell you really in what order all 30 stings went down. I remember the first ones and the last ones. But, anyone that tells you that's not being honest, because it's a long period of time.
Well, and let's talk about that period of time. This was the early, I think it was the early 70s, or was it the late 60s? I'm trying to...
No, it was the early 70s. I went down to ASU in 71. We started doing the stings at the end of 71, beginning of 72. I went back to Kansas with a price on my head. They were going to kill me, the guys we kept hitting. And we didn't just hit them. We hit other nefarious groups, too, around the country. So, believe me, there were guys looking for us, and we kept moving around. Before we got that home, we lived in many different apartments, and we always stayed kind of close to each other, and we had a crew of up to 11 men at one point. And whenever we went to a movie or out to eat, we had rules. Always kept your back to the wall, try and go out with other guys. We were always armed, always carried a 38, 5-shot air weight, and a 25 automatic in my boot, and had weapons everywhere at my house or apartment, and so did Don. I mean, it was you believe you're invincible. I mean, I really did. And as soon as shootouts happened and we didn't get killed and things matriculated forward, the more you get done, the more you believe that you're godlike. And that's really is what gets you killed. It got Woodbeck killed years later, where you think you are bulletproof. And eventually it led me back to Kansas City. I got fed up, and I knew the end was coming, and I had no intention of continuing this life, but my uncle was flying the Attorney General of Kansas around, who was running for governor. His name was Vern Miller. And he got a dossier about me, which the chief lawgiver of states gets on a high-level criminal or gangster, what have you, transferring from one vicinity to another, one area to another. And he goes, Mort, that was my uncle, they're flying in a plane. And Mort goes, yeah. He goes, you got a relative named Craig Glazer? And he goes, yeah, I got a nephew, because it's not a common name. He goes, what's up with your nephew? He goes, hey, he's at school in Arizona. I think he's going to move and go to school here in Missouri. He goes, oh, this must be him. You better read this dossier. And he did, and he went, Jesus. And he goes, do you think it's true? And he goes, I don't know. And he goes, I want to see this boy. He'd make a good agent. And my uncle went, what? Because, it's all about me being basically a glorified thug. And
right.
But it was the beginning of the drug wars, and they didn't really have guys like me, kind of a Frank Serpico, long-haired, undercover. Well, I'd been doing the same thing I would do for law enforcement, out of law enforcement. So, I don't think that's ever happened in modern times. Not only that, I wasn't 21. They made me an agent when I was 20, and you got to be 21 to really be a gun-carrying cop. But they circumvented that, and I guess you could do that in Andy of Mayberry. But I was real proud of it. That I got the gold badge, and people go, wow, weren't you kind of a traitor jumping sides? I went, I didn't see it that way, I thought I was going to do some good and go after the really bad guys and use the drug laws to go after killers and murderers, and it was cool that I could pull over cars and meet girls with that bad. I mean, anyone gave me crap, I could arrest them or badge into ball games.
Craig, I thought it was interesting that you found that when you were working on the other side, that the motives were just as questionable by the people in law enforcement as they were, people doing drug deals. I mean, they were not all good guys with angels' wings.
No, we've heard this many times that there's not a big difference between, the lawman and the outlaw, and there really, from my experience, there isn't. There's some great cops out there that risk their lives to protect us, but I think everyone's got a little bit of larceny in their heart, and everyone's got a little bit of goodness, I'm not talking about serial killers and crazies, but your day-to-day guys that go out and do this, whether they be FBI agents or police officers or organized crime guys, I think there's a certain mindset of accomplishment and pride in what they do, and there's not a big, that's why either side would be good at the other side, and that's happened not as often. In my case, it's more rare for a criminal to become law enforcement than law enforcement maybe after a career to go the other way. But The worst thing, and the thing I care about now, is our lack of interest by the government to fix what I think is the biggest problem in this country, and that's drug and alcohol abuse. And we just had no interest. I mean, it's all about power and money. It still is. And, you know, when it's convenient to pull the drug card, make a bunch of drug arrests on Colombians, our government does that. And when we're dealing with a war like we're in now, or ending war, then we do that and leave the other side alone. It's not really like we care. I never went to any meetings when I was an AG agent with the FBI or DEA where there was any discussion about what we could do to make it better, because most people use illegal drugs at some point in their life, thus making them a drug dealer to a certain, you know, if you're going to the concert and you need to get that ticket, and, you know, you'll sell half bag of that weed to your friend, you can make that $40 to pay for your ticket, and that makes you a drug dealer, or the same with cocaine. I mean, I don't meet very many people that haven't used illegal drugs. I'm not saying everyone has, but most people. You've got 3 presidents in a row that admit it. Clinton, Obama said he snorted coke, and Bush had a major alcohol, if not drug problem at one point. So it's pretty hypocritical to lock up Tommy Chong for selling bongs. I mean, you know, something needs to be done. Most people are in jail today, having been there myself and been on both sides of this, because of a drug-related issue. The O.J. Simpson murder case, I worked for Hard Copy then, I'm getting way ahead of myself. You know, that was definitely a drug gone wrong nutcase. I mean, the guy was a drug addict, and that's what happened. That's what caused that murder. And most people in prison are there, probably 80%. They may have robbed a bank, but it was to get money for drugs or some related thing. So obviously that needs to be the attack of how to deal with this. We're not going to eradicate it by arresting everyone. So we need to use safer drugs, which are available, or things that can get people off drugs or kill their addiction, which are also available, and have the government support that instead of trying to arrest everybody. You're just arresting your neighbor's kid for the most part. And, you know, it hasn't gotten us anywhere, has it?
No, I would say no. Craig, we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to talk a little bit. I want to bring your story all the way forward. First of all, in terms of the King of Sting, is there a movie involved? Have you sold the option to make a movie on that?
Well, I signed with an agency called Creative Artists a few months ago. The book came out in July. And for listeners, if you want to get the book, it's on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, Borders, most major bookstores, and I hope you read it. We've gotten great reviews. You've read it and have your opinions. I think if you like The Departed or No Country for Old Men or The Godfather, this is your book. I'm real proud of it. And you know, if the movie doesn't get made, then at least I got the book into libraries and around the country and accomplished that. But yeah, I hope so. I'm going out to L.A. to answer your question in 2 weeks to meet with a bunch of filmmakers, and hopefully that will happen. But you know, no matter how great your story, it's still the lottery. You know, there's a lot. You know, everybody wants to do the next Batman or Spider-Man or this type of thing, or redo Davy Crockett. It's even more difficult in this bad economy for people to take chances and do something new. And though, like you mentioned, Catch Me If You Can or Blow, and it's its own story. And I think when you read the book, you'll see there's probably more than one movie there. It covers almost 3 decades. So. You know, I think it can be farmed into a series of movies, which would be great. But I'm going to do the best I can to have that happen. I would love to see it. I'm not a young guy anymore. When I first went to Hollywood, which is in the book and you read, with Woodbeck, where he was murdered, we planned on it being a movie then, and we sold the rights to, or optioned them to 4 different studios over a decade. After Don died, I kept going. And when I was in prison, I got in the movie business because I was offered an opportunity to work on the Muhammad Ali story. And I did that and made a movie called Champions Forever starring Muhammad Ali right when I got out of prison in 1988-89. And now my second one on him comes out in May called Muhammad Ali, The Lost and Last Interviews Champion Forever. And I actually interview Ali, and of course they were shot a while ago when he could still talk better. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Hopefully it will be a movie, and you know, all I can do is try, but it's kind of out of my hands. But not at this moment, no, it has not been bought. I've had people are interested. I think there'll be a deal, but whether the movie gets made, who knows?
And when we started talking, I mentioned that there were 2 supporting characters in the book that I found interesting. Woodbeck, who we've talked about in great detail, and your dad, who, excuse me, as you say, every guy, wants to make their own stand, impress something upon their father. You've had this interesting thing where, your dad had no idea what was going on with you until you went back to Kansas City, and now you're known in a completely different line of business for your comedy club in Kansas City, Stanford.
Right. There's probably people listening that may know about that.
Yeah,
my dad and I started. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, as we're kind of heading into the end here, but tell everybody a little bit about the comedy club and how that came about, and we'll kind of wrap up with that.
I could write a great book about comedy, unrelated to this, but with my, and it'll be when we do the next book, there'll be a lot of my relationship with comic stars over the last 3 decades, from Robin Williams to all the way up to Larry the Cable Guy, who I worked with when he was Dan Whitney, and now he's Larry the Cable Guy. And we opened a restaurant called Stanford & Sons in 1975 in Kansas City, and I found time to do that too. And my dad's name is Dan Glazer, so thus the title, which was kind of a steal off the hit TV show Sanford & Son. People thought it was a barbecue at first, but we had great food.
Kansas City, sure.
You're right. We had fun. It was kind of like hula hands and this type of thing, but we eventually had the idea with another young comic named David Nastor in the late 70s to take one little room and make it a comedy club on the weekends. And there were maybe a handful of comedy clubs then across America, but we got to get a lot of big stars back then, or stars on the rise, because if you weren't a big name like Gabe Kaplan or Jimmy Walker back then, who were the big guys, if you were Roseanne Barr or Tom Arnold or Sam Kinison, you had nowhere to play. They were open micers in Los Angeles, so they would come and headline our club for a few $100. So I got to meet and work with all the biggest comedy, movie, and television stars of our time. It's easier to say who didn't play there. Over 30 years, everybody, Pauly Shore, even the icons like Jimmy Walker and Gabe Kaplan. But more recently, people like Lisa Lampanelli, Louis Black was just here. We've become good friends. In fact, on the back of the book, Louis is the one that talked me into writing the book. Lou was going to write the book, the comedian Louis Black, and he puts a nice comment on the back of the book about how much how he feels about it. And, I get to talk to these people, and Tommy Chong, Cheech and Chong, he and I were pen pals when he was in prison. I've got a gazillion stories on these people, but worked with Ellen DeGeneres when she was coming up. Because of my age, I'm kind of went from young guy to middle-aged guy with all these people. and I'm sitting here talking to you from my comedy club in Kansas City, Kansas, Stanford & Sons, which this is a new one. And it's a beautiful theater. And like this week, we have a new big star named Jim Jeffries from Australia, his name probably doesn't mean much to your listeners, but it will. He's going to be the next big Louis Black guy, and he's coming over here to be a big star, very funny guy. So it's neat to discover people, and I do a lot. You can hear from my voice. I do a lot of radio in Kansas City as a guest with the comedians, and it kind of makes you a local celebrity, much like I was as a criminal in Arizona. I am here through the comedy clubs until this book came out. That's what I've been known as. So it's kind of shocking. I think the headline in Kansas City was Craig Glazer rats himself out when they read the book, or they're going, wow. They hear rumors and jokes on the radio, but when you read it, it's right in front of you, and you see all that went down. It's kind of shocking. But my dad and I were, we've had an on-again, off-again relationship. There have been magazine stories about our famous feuds where we've sued each other. And, one time we had a bunch of comedy clubs in the Midwest. But today, my dad's now in his 70s. He looks like Dean Martin. He's a good-looking guy. He's been into his third marriage. As you read the book, we're both, like they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I've tried to be a good guy, a good bad guy, like you said, but when you're living that life, as people say, well, you were a gangster, you're a criminal. I don't see it that way. I never pointed my weapon at anyone. If you were on the other end of my gun, you were a bad guy. I never robbed a store, stole a piece of bubble gum, cheated an honest man. So I've always felt good about that. I went to prison, which we didn't talk about, in the mid to late 80s. I did 4.5 years because I set up a sting to get revenge for my partner Woodbeck's murder. I thought I was ripping off the Colombian drug dealers. I hired actors to pose as mafiosa in the West Coast, setting up a sting from L.A., from Los Angeles, where I lived then, in Vegas, all the way across the country on a money laundering scheme, and was ripping these guys off for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They thought I was laundering all this Colombian drug money. I was just ripping it off with actors posing as mobsters. They only wanted to work with organized crime out of Vegas, so I created that. I was 28. Turned out they were the federal task force out to get the mafia in Vegas, and I took them for over $1 million. They weren't very happy about it, and I ended up getting a 7-year prison sentence and did 4.5 years in federal prison because of it. But that kind of ended my story back then, and I learned, a valuable. I was at first I was angry I was in jail because I didn't think I deserved it for ripping off what I thought were criminals. I didn't know they were the FBI, and I figured if they were, they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. But in the end, I went, you know what? I'm lucky this is all that happened to me. And my prison experience was kind of like being in the Army. I mean, there was a lot of good and bad things that happened, but I learned a lot. And when I got out, like the judge said, you'll be relatively young, and I was. I was 34 years old when I got out. And then I went and did the Ali movie, and then kept going.
Well, folks, Craig Glazer's book, The King of Sting, it's a real colorful account. It's a very quick read. I encourage you to pick it up, read it. You can get it at your local bookstore or online, as Craig mentioned earlier, at Amazon.com or MrMedia.com. Craig, we're about out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show today, and wish you continued good luck.
Well, thanks for having me on. And as the story, continues, when there's a movie or the next thing, maybe when this next Ali movie comes out, I'd love to come back on, certainly with the next book, and we'll chat further because I've enjoyed it.
That'd be great. And we look forward to hearing more from you. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. For folks, for dozens more celebrity and media newsmaker interviews, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. It's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with everyone from Kirk Douglas to Cheryl Hines from Curb Your Enthusiasm, and many, many authors and directors, all kinds of good stuff. Please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, DigitalJournal.com, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Zencast, Odeo, the Kindle Reader, or iTunes. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman, ANDELMAN.com. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate when you take a little piece of your day and share it with us.